Right now, there is a porch in Tucson, Arizona, and it holds a secret that federal investigators have not been able to crack for months. The surveillance lens that watched that driveway shattered, not cracked, not malfunctioning, shattered. The hallway tiles marked with crimson stains that no explanation has fully addressed. And on the ground, left behind like it meant nothing at all, was a small piece of medical technology. A pacemaker, the device that was keeping an 84-year-old woman alive. Whoever removed it knew exactly what they were doing. They knew that without it, her heart would stop. They left it there anyway. Her name is Nancy Guthrie. She is 84 years old. She was last seen alive on a Saturday evening in February 2026, dropped off at her own front door by people she trusted completely. By sunrise, she was gone. No confirmed sighting, no arrest, no body. Just a $100,000 reward that has not moved a single credible lead. A national media storm that has since gone quiet. And one man who knows exactly what happened that night and has not said a single word to investigators. Not because he cannot, because he chose not to. That choice is what this investigation is about. Pima County authorities confirmed it on the record. The scene showed unmistakable markers of a violent forced entry. Search teams scoured the desolate brush directly behind the property line for days. Federal agents were called in. The case reached the White House. Grainy surveillance footage of an obscured figure near the perimeter was broadcast nationally, and still nothing. The question investigators keep returning to is not just where Nancy went, it is who made sure no one could follow.
To understand what happened to Nancy Guthrie on the night of February 1st, 2026, you need to understand who she was before that night. Because this was never a standard missing person case, not from the beginning. The woman who disappeared was not a stranger. She was not a drifter. She was not isolated or forgotten. She was the center of an entire world, and every person in that world is still trying to make sense of the fact that she is gone. Her name at birth was Nancy Slingerland. She grew up in a different America, one where neighbors knew your name without being introduced, where community was not a word people used at charity events, but something you actually built with your hands and your time. That was the world Nancy came from, and it was the world she carried with her for the rest of her life. She married Charles Guthrie, and together they put down permanent roots in Tucson, Arizona. Charles worked as a chemist, mixing compounds and building a quiet professional life. Nancy built something different. She directed academic operations at the local university, overseeing the kind of behind-the-scenes institutional work that rarely gets recognition but holds everything together. They were not famous, they were not wealthy, they were reliable, decent, present, the kind of couple every neighborhood hopes to have. They raised 5 children together. 5. Think about what that means, not just as a number, but as a life. 5 birthdays every year, 5 sets of school performances, 5 different personalities around one dinner table, 5 futures to worry about and celebrate and watch unfold. Nancy did not just manage that household, she anchored it. Then, in 1988, Charles died suddenly. Nancy was 46 years old. 46. Not old, not ready. Widowed with 5 children and a full life still ahead of her, she had every reason to pull back from the world.
Many people would have. Many people do. Nancy did not. Instead of retreating, she leaned harder into the things that had always defined her. Her faith became the axis her life turned on. She became a fixture at St. Philip's in the Hills Episcopal Parish, not as an occasional attendee, but as someone who showed up every single weekend without fail for decades, because showing up was simply who she was. She volunteered, she organized, she checked in on sick neighbors without being asked. She remembered the names of people who assumed they had been forgotten. She was the woman who arrived at your door before you even knew you needed help. Her daughter, Annie, eventually married a man named Tomaso Chion. Keep that name in your mind, because despite everything that was about to happen, Nancy was never truly alone in those years. She was surrounded by family, by her parish community, by decades of relationships built on the kind of trust that takes a lifetime to earn. Isolation was not her reality. She was protected. She was loved. But she had one specific vulnerability that everyone in her inner circle knew about. Her heart needed help. A pacemaker had been implanted in her chest, a small, precise piece of technology calibrated to keep her heart beating at a safe and steady rhythm. Without it, the consequences were not uncertain, they were guaranteed. Everyone who spent time with Nancy knew this. Her doctors knew it, her children knew it, the people who saw her every week at her parish knew it. And on the night she disappeared, someone made a deliberate choice about that device. That choice tells us everything we need to know about the nature of this crime. This was not a random act. This was not an opportunistic attack. Someone who understood exactly what that pacemaker meant, exactly what removing it would do, made a calculated decision. The question is not who had the opportunity. The question is who had the knowledge. Late Saturday evening, February 1st, 2026. Annie and her husband Tomaso Chion took Nancy out for dinner. A normal evening, the kind of thing families do without thinking about it, without marking it in memory, without imagining it will become the subject of a federal investigation. They ate together, they drove her home. They pulled up to her house on that quiet Tucson street the way they had done before, the way anyone does when dropping off an elderly parent after a family meal. And then the night became something no one has been able to fully explain. What happened in the minutes after that car stopped in front of Nancy's house? Who walked her to the door? Who went inside? Who stayed outside? Who was the last person standing in that doorway with her before the door closed? Those questions should have straightforward answers. In a normal situation, they do. You drop someone off. You remember it. You tell investigators exactly what happened because you have nothing to hide. That is not what happened here. What investigators got instead was a version of events with gaps. Gaps in the timeline, gaps in the account of those final minutes on the porch. And then, when they pressed for clarity, something even more unsettling than a gap: silence. Nancy Guthrie was last seen alive that Saturday evening. By sunrise Sunday morning, she was gone. Not moved to a hospital, not staying with a friend. Gone. As in, no one knew where she was, no one could reach her, and the house that should have contained her held only evidence of something violent.
Before we get into what investigators found at that scene, there is something you need to sit with for a moment. This woman was 84 years old. She had a pacemaker. She was not someone who could have gone far on her own in the middle of the night, even if she had wanted to. Whoever took Nancy Guthrie had to have known that, had to have planned for it, had to have understood that the clock on her survival was not just ticking, it was accelerating the moment that pacemaker left her body. This was not impulsive. This was not spontaneous. This required knowledge, access, and preparation. When Pima County authorities arrived at the scene, What they documented was not ambiguous. The evidence at Nancy Guthrie's residence showed unmistakable markers of a violent forced entry. That is the official language, unmistakable markers. That phrase is doing a lot of work. It means investigators looked at what was in front of them and could not construct a scenario in which this happened accidentally or without intent. The surveillance camera covering the driveway, disabled, not because of a power outage, not because of a malfunction, deliberately blocked in the hours before Nancy disappeared so that nothing recorded what happened that night in front of that house. Think about that for a moment. Someone knew where that camera was. Someone knew what it covered. Someone made a decision in the hours before Nancy vanished to make sure that no footage existed of what was about to happen. That is not the behavior of a stranger who stumbled onto an opportunity. That is the behavior of someone who had been inside that house before. Someone who had stood in that driveway and looked up and noted the angle of that lens and filed it away. The hallway tiles held crimson stains. The pacemaker was found at the scene, not taken, left behind on the floor like it was nothing, like it was disposable, like the life it had been sustaining was disposable. Search teams moved into the desolate brush directly behind the property line. Dogs, agents, equipment. They scoured that terrain with everything available to them. Nancy was not there. A ransom demand was issued. Federal investigators received it, analyzed it, and began trying to trace its origin. At the same time, grainy surveillance footage from a neighbor's camera showing an obscured figure near the perimeter of Nancy's property was released to the public. The figure was real. The figure was present. The figure could not be identified with certainty. A $50,000 reward was announced. It generated 0 concrete leads. Not one credible tip, not one witness who came forward with anything that moved the investigation. In a neighborhood, in daylight hours before the disappearance, with federal resources and national media coverage. 0. That does not happen by accident. The reward was later doubled to $100,000. The silence held. When investigators encounter a reward that large producing nothing, there are 2 explanations. The first is that genuinely is nothing to find, that whoever is responsible operated so cleanly that no one outside of the crime itself has any information. The second explanation is that someone is actively working to ensure that silence holds, that anyone who might know something is either too afraid to speak or has been given a reason not to. Both of those explanations point to the same thing: a perpetrator who is not operating in a panic, a perpetrator who is patient, organized, and confident. The FBI was brought in. The case reached the White House briefing level because of who Nancy Guthrie's daughter is, a prominent national broadcaster with the kind of professional connections that make federal officials take notice. With all of that firepower, with federal agents and national media and a 6-figure reward, the investigation hit a wall because a critical piece of evidence disappeared. DNA evidence that should have been collected, cataloged, and preserved from the scene was reportedly mishandled. The chain of custody broke. What that evidence could have proved, what conclusions it could have supported, what questions it could have answered, gone. Not because the crime scene failed to produce it, because the system that was supposed to protect it failed. That failure had consequences. Investigators who might have built a case around physical evidence were forced to rely instead on behavioral evidence, on timelines, on inconsistencies in accounts, on the question of who was the last person with Nancy and why that person stopped cooperating with the investigation the moment the questions became specific. In the days after Nancy disappeared, as the search expanded and the media coverage intensified, investigators were working against a reality they could not control. Every hour that passed without finding her was an hour in which her medical situation was deteriorating. Without her pacemaker, her heart was not operating safely. The people leading the search knew this. Her family knew this. Everyone knew this. And the person who took her knew this too. Which means either they planned to keep her alive for a reason, or they planned from the beginning that she would not survive. There is no version of this crime in which the perpetrator did not understand exactly what removing that pacemaker meant for the timeline. There is no version in which that was an oversight. The question investigators kept returning to, the question that kept landing in the same place no matter which direction they approached it from, was this: who in Nancy Guthrie's life had the access, the knowledge, the motive, and the preparation to pull this off? And why, when detectives finally sat down with the one person who could answer that question, did that person pick up the phone, call a lawyer, and go completely silent?
His name is Tomaso Chion. He married Annie Guthrie, Nancy's daughter, and in doing so, he became part of a family that had spent decades building something real. He sat at that table. He was at those dinners. He was present for the ordinary moments that make up a family life: the holidays, the birthdays, the Sunday afternoons, the quiet evenings when an elderly woman sits in her living room and trusts that the people around her are exactly who they appear to be. That is the first thing you need to understand about Tomaso Chion. He was not a stranger to Nancy Guthrie. He was not someone who appeared in her life without warning or context. He was family. He had earned that access the way family members do, through time, through presence, through the gradual accumulation of trust that comes from being a consistent part of someone's world. And that access is precisely what makes the details of his behavior so significant. At some point, Tomaso Chion assumed significant control over Nancy Guthrie's finances. The exact timeline of when this began, how it was structured, and the full scope of what it covered has not been publicly disclosed in complete detail. But what investigators established is that the financial relationship between Tomaso and his mother-in-law was not incidental, it was substantial. He was not simply helping her manage a few bills, he had positioned himself as the central figure in the financial life of an 84-year-old widow with a heart condition. Now, that alone is not evidence of wrongdoing. Adult children and their spouses often help elderly parents manage finances. That is a normal part of aging families. People do it out of love, out of practicality, out of necessity. The presence of financial oversight is not, by itself, a red flag. What makes it a red flag in this case is everything else that surrounds it. Nancy Guthrie had 5 children. 5. She had decades of relationships within her community, within her parish, within her neighborhood. She was not a woman without options or support. The question that investigators and her family members began asking was not simply whether Tomaso was managing her money. The question was whether Nancy's other children were aware of the full extent of that control, whether they had been kept informed, whether there had been conversations, concerns, friction. The architecture of financial control over a vulnerable elderly person is one of the most well-documented patterns in elder abuse cases in the United States. It rarely announces itself as abuse at the beginning. It begins with helpfulness. It begins with convenience. It begins with someone stepping in at a moment when an elderly person genuinely needs assistance and positioning themselves as the solution. And then, gradually, that position solidifies. Access becomes control. Control becomes dependency. And by the time anyone outside the immediate relationship notices, the architecture is already built. Investigators who work elder financial abuse cases have a specific term for the moment when that architecture becomes visible from the outside. They call it the isolation signature. the point at which a vulnerable person has been gradually separated from the independent financial relationships and information that would allow them to recognize or report what is happening to them. Whether that pattern applies in this case is something investigators were actively examining. But the financial control is not the most damning detail about Tomaso Chion. The camera is. In the hours before Nancy Guthrie disappeared, the surveillance camera covering the driveway of her Tucson home was deliberately blocked. Not malfunctioning, not coincidentally offline, blocked, rendered incapable of recording what happened in front of that house on the night of February 1st, 2026. Whoever blocked that camera knew it was there, knew what it covered, knew that without disabling it, there would be a visual record of the events of that evening. Tomaso Chion was the last person known to have been at that house with Nancy Guthrie. He had been there before, many times. He knew the property. He knew the layout. He knew where the camera was and what it captured and what it would record if it were left operational. The decision to block it did not happen spontaneously. It happened in the hours before the disappearance. That is a planning behavior. That is someone thinking through a sequence of events in advance and taking steps to eliminate evidence before the crime occurs. Criminologists have a specific term for this as well: precautionary sequencing. It is one of the behavioral markers that distinguishes premeditated crimes from impulsive ones. And premeditation changes everything about how investigators approach a case. An impulsive crime is chaotic. It leaves traces everywhere because the perpetrator is reacting, not executing. A premeditated crime executed by someone with access and knowledge and time to prepare leaves traces only where the perpetrator failed to anticipate. The blocked camera tells us not just what Tomaso did, it tells us how he was thinking. It tells us that he was calm enough, organized enough, and confident enough to walk through the steps of what was about to happen and address each potential vulnerability in advance. That is not the behavior of someone who panicked. When detectives finally sat down with Tomaso Chion and asked him to walk them through the timeline of that Saturday evening, every movement, every conversation, every decision from the moment he and Annie picked up Nancy for dinner to the moment they left her at her front door, he did not cooperate. He retained legal counsel. He went entirely silent. Now, his constitutional right to do so is not in question. The Fifth Amendment exists for a reason, and the decision to stop speaking to investigators without legal representation is a right that belongs to everyone in this country, regardless of guilt or innocence. That is not the issue. The issue is behavioral. When someone who just lost a family member, a mother-in-law they presumably cared about, is asked by investigators to help reconstruct what happened on the night she disappeared, the instinct of an innocent person is not silence. The instinct of an innocent person is urgency. It is desperation to help. It is the inability to stop talking because every piece of information you can provide feels like it might be the piece that brings her home. Tomaso Chion did not exhibit that behavior. He calculated, he lawyered up, he stopped talking. Investigators were left with a timeline full of gaps that only one person could fill, and that person had decided the gaps would stay. Think about what those gaps contain. The final minutes on that porch, who walked to the door, who went inside, whether Nancy was alive and unharmed when they left, whether anyone else was present, whether anything unusual happened during dinner or on the drive home, whether Nancy said anything, expressed any fear of anyone in her life. All of it sealed behind a lawyer's instruction to say nothing. The behavioral profile that emerges from these details is not subtle. Financial control over a vulnerable elderly person,
knowledge of the property and its security systems, deliberate disabling of surveillance in the hours before the crime, last known presence with the victim, and then, when investigators came looking for answers, a complete and immediate shutdown. Criminologists who study family-portrayed crimes against elderly victims identify a consistent pattern in how those crimes are concealed in the immediate aftermath. The perpetrator, who has the advantage of insider knowledge, uses that knowledge to shape the early narrative of the investigation. They present themselves as cooperative while providing details that are technically accurate but strategically incomplete. They offer details that direct attention elsewhere while withholding the details that matter most. And when the questioning becomes too specific, when investigators start getting close to the gaps, the cooperation ends. The cooperation between Tomaso Chion and investigators ended. There is one more detail about this case that has not received the attention it deserves. Nancy Guthrie's other children, her 4 other children who were not part of the household Tomaso occupied, who were not the ones managing her mother's finances, who were not the ones who had dinner with her the last night she was seen alive. Those children are living with a reality that no amount of media coverage or federal investigation has resolved. Their mother is missing. The man who was with her last will not tell them what happened.
The United States loses approximately 600,000 people to missing persons cases every year. 600,000. Most of them are found quickly. Most of them are runaways, people in crisis, individuals who made a choice to leave and were located within days. But a significant number are not found quickly. A significant number enter a bureaucratic and investigative system that was not designed to handle them, that is chronically underfunded, chronically understaffed, and structured in ways that guarantee certain cases will receive extraordinary attention, while others disappear into a database that no one is actively monitoring. Nancy Guthrie's case received extraordinary attention, and it still failed her. That failure did not begin on the night of February 1. It did not begin when the surveillance camera went dark, or when the pacemaker was left on the floor, or when the crimson stains dried on the hallway tiles. The failure that allowed what happened to Nancy Guthrie to happen, and then allowed the investigation into what happened to stall the way it did, was already built into the structure of the institutions that were supposed to protect her long before that Saturday evening. Start with the evidence. In the immediate aftermath of any violent crime, the integrity of physical evidence is the foundation on which everything else is built. Investigators know this. Prosecutors know this. Defense attorneys know this. The chain of custody, the careful documentation of what was collected, where it was stored, and who had access to it at every point, is not bureaucratic formality. It is the difference between a case that can be prosecuted and a case that cannot. The DNA evidence collected from the scene of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance was mishandled. That is not a rumor. That is not speculation from online investigators who have been following the case. That is a documented failure in the official handling of evidence from an active federal investigation. The specific details of how the chain of custody broke, at what point the evidence became compromised, and who bears institutional responsibility for that failure have not been fully disclosed. What is known is that evidence which should have existed, evidence that investigators could have used to build a physical case connecting a perpetrator to that scene, was no longer viable. Think about what that means in practical terms. A perpetrator who is sophisticated enough to disable surveillance cameras in advance, sophisticated enough to plan and execute an abduction without a single witness coming forward, sophisticated enough to stay silent in the face of federal questioning, that perpetrator is going to be very difficult to convict on behavioral evidence alone.
Behavioral evidence is powerful. Behavioral evidence tells a story, but in a courtroom, behavioral evidence needs physical evidence to anchor it. It needs the jury to look at a piece of forensic proof and understand that the story being told is not interpretation, not inference, not theory. Without that anchor, cases stall. And when cases stall, perpetrators walk. The mishandling of that DNA evidence was not the only systemic failure in the investigation. There was also the question of the initial response timeline. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old, living alone, with a known cardiac condition requiring an implanted device. She had family who knew her routines, who knew her schedule, who knew that she did not simply disappear without contact. When she was reported missing, the question investigators should have been asking from the first hour was not whether she had wandered off or chosen to leave. She was 84 years old with a pacemaker. She could not have gotten far on her own, even if she had wanted to. But the initial response did not treat this case with the urgency that those facts demanded. There is a documented bias in missing persons investigations towards assuming that elderly individuals who disappear have done so because of cognitive decline or voluntary departure. It is a bias built into how initial reports are assessed, how resources are allocated in the first critical hours, and how quickly a case gets escalated from a local police matter to something that demands federal involvement. Those first 48 hours are not recoverable. The evidence that exists at hour 1 is not the same evidence that exists at hour 48. Witnesses who might have come forward with information on day 1 are harder to locate and harder to trust on day 5. Forensic evidence degrades, trails go cold, and perpetrators who understand these timelines use them deliberately. The gap between when Nancy Guthrie was reported missing and when the full weight of the investigation was brought to bear on her case, that gap has never been fully accounted for. Now, here is the part of this story that the national media coverage largely ignored because it was less cinematically compelling than the family drama at the center of the case. But it is the part that matters most if you're interested not just in what happened to Nancy Guthrie, but in what this case reveals about the country we actually live in. Nancy Guthrie's case commanded federal agents because her daughter is a prominent national broadcaster. Not because Nancy herself had powerful connections, not because of anything she had done professionally or politically, because of who her daughter is. Because a media figure with access to national platforms and professional relationships with people in positions of authority made phone calls, and those phone calls resulted in a level of federal engagement that most missing persons cases never see. That is not a criticism of Annie or of the family for using every resource available to them. If your mother disappeared, you would do the same thing. You would call everyone you knew. You would pull every string. You would do whatever it took to make sure the people with the power to find her were paying attention. The criticism is of the system that required those phone calls to function. Because right now, in the same week that Nancy Guthrie's case was receiving White House briefings and national news coverage and federal manhunt resources, there were other missing elderly Americans whose cases received nothing. There were other 84-year-old women and 80-year-old men and 76-year-old grandparents who disappeared from their homes or their care facilities or their neighborhoods and whose cases were entered into a database and assigned to an overworked local detective with 40 other open files, whose photographs were not broadcast nationally, whose reward funds were not established because their families did not have the financial resources to offer $100,000 to a public that was not watching anyway. The FBI estimates that elder financial abuse alone costs American seniors more than $3 billion every year. Every year. That number represents not just money stolen, but autonomy stripped away, families fractured, and elderly people left in situations of dependency and vulnerability that make them targets for exactly the kind of crime that appears to be committed against Nancy Guthrie. And the vast majority of those cases are never investigated with the seriousness they deserve. They are handled as civil matters, as family disputes, as sad but ultimately private failures. The criminal apparatus that exists to protect people is rarely aimed at the people who need it most. Elder abuse happens in kitchens and living rooms and at dining room tables where trust has been methodically exploited over months and years. It doesn't look like a crime from the outside. From the outside, it looks like family. It looks like a son-in-law helping his wife's elderly mother manage her finances. It looks like care. And by the time the mask comes off, by the time the nature of the relationship becomes impossible to ignore, the damage is already done. Nancy Guthrie had 5 children who loved her. She had a parish community that relied on her. She had decades of relationships built on genuine mutual care and respect. She was not supposed to be vulnerable. She was not supposed to be a target. She was supposed to be protected by the very structures, family, community, institutions that were surrounding her. Every one of those structures failed. The family structure failed because someone inside it was operating with an agenda that no one outside it fully understood until it was too late. The institutional structure failed because the initial response was too slow and the evidence handling was too careless. The media structure failed because the coverage was driven by the prominence of a single family connection rather than by the severity of what happened to a woman who deserved attention on her own terms, not on the basis of who her daughter knows. And the legal structure. The legal structure is still failing because a man who may know exactly what happened to Nancy Guthrie is sitting behind a lawyer's instruction and a constitutional right that the system is powerless to override. That is not a bug. That is the system working as designed. But the system as designed is
As of today, the case of Nancy Guthrie remains open. No arrest has been made. No body has been recovered. No one has been charged with anything. The investigation is active in the sense that it has not been officially closed, but active and progressing are not the same thing, and the distance between those two words is where Nancy Guthrie currently lives, somewhere between a case that is technically being worked and a case that has run out of the momentum it needs to reach a conclusion. The $100,000 reward is still available. $100,000 for information leading to a resolution. Full anonymity guaranteed. The Tucson Police Department, the FBI, and the national tip lines established in the early days of the investigation are all still accepting submissions. The infrastructure for someone to come forward is entirely in place. The money is there, the protection is there, the channel is open. What is not there is the person willing to use it. And that tells you something important about the nature of what investigators are dealing with. A $100,000 reward does not go unclaimed because no one has information. It goes unclaimed because the people who have information have calculated that the cost of coming forward is higher than the reward for doing so. That calculation does not happen in a vacuum. It happens in the context of a specific social environment, specific relationships, specific threats, real or perceived, that make silence feel safer than truth. Someone in the orbit of this case knows what happened to Nancy Guthrie. That is not speculation. That is the logical conclusion of the evidence. Crimes of this nature, premeditated, executed with this level of planning and precision, do not happen in complete isolation. There is always a chain of awareness that extends beyond the perpetrator. A conversation that was overheard, a behavior that was noticed and filed away, a moment of unusual anxiety in someone who should have been calm,
a detail that did not make sense at the time and has been making less sense ever since. That person may be watching this video right now. If you were in Tucson in early February 2026, search your memory. Not for the dramatic, not for the obvious, but for the small things. A vehicle parked on a residential street that did not belong to anyone you recognized. A figure moving through the brush behind a property line at an hour when no one should have been there. A conversation that ended too quickly when you walked into the room. A person whose behavior in the days surrounding February 1 was different in a way you could not explain but could not stop noticing. Those are the details that break cases. Not the dramatic revelations, not the confessions, the small things that the perpetrator did not think anyone noticed because they seemed too minor to matter. The cases that get solved after months and years of stalling almost always crack because someone finally decided that a detail they had been carrying was too heavy to keep carrying alone. You can submit a tip and never have your name attached to it. You can make a phone call from a number that is never traced back to you. You can send information through channels that are specifically designed to protect the person providing it. The anonymity is not a promise made to attract cooperation. It is a structural feature of the system. It holds. If you are holding a piece of this, the door is open. And then there's the other person watching this video, the one who is not an innocent bystander carrying an accidental memory, the one who knows not because they happened to see something, but because they were involved, because they helped directly or indirectly, knowingly or under pressure, because someone they are protecting made a choice that night that they have been living with ever since. You know what carrying a secret like this does to you over time. You already know. It does not get lighter. It does not become easier to compartmentalize. It does not fade the way ordinary memories fade. It sits. It sits in the moments when everything is quiet and your mind has nothing else to occupy it. And it sits in the crowded moments too, at dinner tables, in family gatherings, and in the spaces between ordinary conversations where your face is doing one thing and your mind is doing something else entirely. There is still a chance to make this right. Not because the law requires it, not because the reward is waiting, but because Nancy Guthrie is a human being. She is a woman who spent 84 years building something in this world. She raised 5 children after losing her husband at 46. She showed up every single weekend for decades to serve a community that needed her. She checked on her neighbors when they were sick. She remembered the names of people who thought they had been forgotten. She was the person everyone in her orbit could count on to be exactly where she said she would be, doing exactly what she said she would do, because reliability was not a quality she performed. It was who she was. She deserves to be found. Her family deserves to know what happened, not the version of events that has been shaped by strategic silence and careful omission, the actual version, the full version, the one that accounts for every gap in the timeline and every question that has been answered by a lawyer's instruction to say nothing. Nancy Guthrie, wherever you are, this channel has not forgotten you. This community has not moved on to the next case while yours sits unresolved. We are still here. We are still looking. And if your remains are out there somewhere waiting to be found, waiting to be brought home and given the dignity of a proper goodbye, we are going to keep making noise until someone with the power to find you is forced to listen. You are not clickbait. You are not a thumbnail. You are an 84-year-old force of nature who built a magnificent life that mattered to thousands of people, and you matter today more than ever. Before this video ends, I want to take a moment for the Audiobook VN community. If you found this channel through Audiobook VN, welcome. Genuinely, sincerely welcome. The fact that this story traveled as far as it did, the fact that it reached you, that it mattered enough to you to follow it here and stay through to the end of a case that is still unresolved and still painful, that means something real to me. Justice does not recognize borders. The truth does not care what language you think in or what country you're watching from.
An 84-year-old woman is missing, and the people who want answers for her are everywhere, and you being part of that is not a small thing. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring. Subscribe, stay close, and I will see you on the next one. Share this video. Right now, before you close it, before you move to the next thing on your screen, share it. Not because this channel needs the numbers, but because Nancy Guthrie's story needs to stay in circulation. Cold cases crack because of public pressure. Alibis collapse under the weight of sustained attention. People who have been holding secrets for months and years eventually find that the cost of silence has become higher than the cost of truth. But that calculation only changes when the case refuses to go quiet. Keep it loud. Drop a comment below. Tell me what you think happened on that porch on the night of February 1, 2026. Tell me which detail out of everything covered in this video you cannot stop thinking about. I read every comment. The most insightful observations from this community have shaped how this channel covers follow-up developments, and there will be follow-up developments because this case is not over. The disappearance of Nancy Guthrie is not a story with a clean ending, not yet. It is a case file that is still open, a timeline that still has gaps, a $100,000 reward that is still waiting, and a man who still hasn't told investigators what happened in the final minutes before an 84-year-old woman vanished from her own home. But beneath all of that, underneath the forensics and the behavioral analysis and the systemic failures and the federal investigation, is something that cannot be buried no matter how many surveillance cameras get disabled or how many lawyers get retained. The truth exists. It happened. Someone knows what it was. And the longer it stays hidden, the more people are watching, the more voices are asking, the more pressure is building from every direction, including this one. Nancy Guthrie vanished on February 1, 2026. This case remains open. We are not going anywhere.